Okay.
Good evening. Good evening and welcome to the first Analysis and Activism talk. My name is Stefano Carpani. When there is yet another crisis, moment in the world politics to face, on behalf of the steering group of Analysis and Activism, I'm pleased to welcome you to this talk by Professor Andrew Samuels. As you know, Analysis and Activism has its roots in the International Association for Analytical Psychology. Andrew Samuels tonight will talk about Psychotherapy and Politics, a cutting-edge and transformative contribution, or a narcissistic total waste of time only of use to therapists. Who is Andrew Samuels? Well, of course, many of you know Andrew. He has been a therapist for almost 50 years and a Jungian analyst for 45 years. For much of that time, he has been a leading figure in the project of bringing what he calls therapy thinking to the study of political issues and making it serve as a basis for political activism. His own political interests include the Palestinian question, economic inequality, race, in quote marks, and the role of man and masculinity in the political world. He has been largely responsible for the creation of organization in the area of analysis and activism. The analysis and activism movement within the membership of the International Association for Analytical Psychology, psychotherapists and counselors for social responsibility in the UK, the Psychotherapy and Counseling Trade Union, Antidote, a campaign for emotional literacy in the public sphere founded with Susie Orbach. He was a founder member of the UK Palestine Mental Health Network. And he was founding consulting editor of the journal Psychotherapy and Politics International. Because of this record, his questioning of the entire project is likely to be of interest to people who are interested in the same thing. I, personally, am interested in the idea of a manifesto to guide our work. I won't list Andrew's many books or clinical and academical positions held, except to say that he has told me many times that first and foremost and above, all he considers himself to be a clinical therapist. This is at the heart of who he is and what he does. Andrew, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Stefano. This talk was first given to the National Psychotherapy Organization of Slovenia. And I note there are some Slovenian friends here. The title was posted on Analysis and Activism, and several people suggested that I should give it. I didn't want to give it for reasons which might become clear. But now that I am giving it, I'm feeling pleased that it is happening. I wanted to talk to people whom I like to consider comrades. I don't mean we necessarily agree, but we have a range of interests that are probably held in common. It is, in a way, a reflection on failure. But I'm not the only baby boomer, child of the 1960s, to feel failure. We all do. Of course, the impact of that era, so fundamental in my formation as a person and as an activist, is very great. But sadly, as the world, for the most part, not universally, lurches to the right, people in my demographic are deeply troubled. I have a slogan. I am definitely not a good loser, but I sure as hell am an experienced one. I want to say something about my personal history because the talk is very obviously personal. We're going to get into everybody's personal histories when it comes to politics later. Over the last few months, as I go through yet another personal therapeutic experience of my own, I begin to see how the shadow of a lot that I have done is adolescent or even infantile rebellion against a dominant family of very spectacular conventionality. It doesn't vitiate or undermine what I do or who I am, but if I don't own it, if I don't own the rebel that has led me into this particular kind of thinking and this particular kind of work, then I would be sadly lacking when speaking as a therapist, which is, as Stefano said, what I more and more feel myself to be. I'm also a very privileged person, wonderful education, which I rejected, dropping out of Oxford in 1967. And I'm a white male. And in the context of psychotherapy, especially psychoanalysis, it is not a problem if you are Jewish. As a privileged person, I have become more and more careful about the seduction of taking a leadership role when thinking about the lives of oppressed and marginalized peoples, whether what we're talking about is racial, gendered, and sexual, or economic. That's why lately I've been studying more and more the question of allyship, of what being an ally of oppressed and marginalized peoples actually means. I don't think on the analysis and activism list or the equivalent list of the International Association for Relational Psychoanalysis and Psychotherapy, I don't think we spend enough time thinking about allyship, which people who are out there doing political work all the time concentrate on and discuss. Allyship is a deep process, and everyone involved in it is in a learning position. Allyship involves a lot of listening. The allyship that I have most recently found myself inhabiting is in relation to race and to Africanists in particular as a white ally. As a white ally, I acknowledge that I have serious limits to what I know about other people's experiences. But this is not a moment for breastbeating. You don't need to use your lack of knowledge as a reason to avoid thinking and acting. So a white ally does not remain silent, but confronts racism in personal, professional, societal, and international contexts all the time. Of course, it involves building relationships and learning from people of color, and also engaging with white people in order to challenge them in their thinking about race. I don't have it all figured out. I just don't want to be complacent. Here is a summary of what you're going to hear. That was, in a way, an introduction to the talk. Part one, what do we mean by psychotherapy and politics? What are the strengths and limitations of this project, of this relationship? Part two, the politics of the person, your politics, and I will talk you through some brief experiential exercises. And part three, I'm going to give you two case histories where analysis and activism or psychotherapy and politics were lived out. One was a success. One largely due to me, was a failure. What do we mean by psychotherapy and politics? What are the strengths and limitations? As you will know from the mission statement for the talk, I am both enthusiastic and skeptical. I think that is really the only place to be. Here I follow the notion of the hermeneutics of suspicion that the psychoanalytically influenced writer Philip Rieff introduced back, I think, in the 70s. But I am enthusiastic. I don't see any problem with being enthusiastic and skeptical. Many of you, especially those with psychoanalytic backgrounds here, will know there has been a long history in which depth psychology as a whole has tried to engage with the political world. It is this that I think is actually a glorious failure. This is my humble opinion. It is a failure, and I feel this so strongly when I look at, for example, the conference coming up next week, Psychoanalysis and the Public Sphere, which is desiccated, abstract, over-academic, hyper-intellectual, and utterly masturbatory in my view. This is a failure. So I want to put forward the notion that we need to cut up the notion, sorry, you can't say notion twice in one sentence, even when you're improvising. I want to delineate 4 different kinds or types of politics that we might think about. One I call mainstream politics. Here, therapists sometimes get into consultancy roles. I've had this experience in American presidential politics and with the Labour Party here in Britain. It's heady, giddy stuff. It goes down very well at dinner parties in Hampstead or Manhattan or such places. It's worth doing because you learn a lot about the possibilities and limitations of the application of therapy thinking to politics by working with the most serious and senior politicians. I'm not absolutely the only person who's had this experience, but we are a very small minority and we are not very popular, because when I was working presidentially in the United States, the New York Times published a somewhat unkind account of how an international group of behavioral scientists were helping Obama to kind of convince the American public of this or that. So there's mainstream politics, and I don't think we should rule it out, but necessarily we're not going to be very active there. The second category of politics or type of politics is radical politics. And obviously, I and others here tonight have histories in radical politics. In my case, the psychotherapists and counselors for social responsibility has been actively working in areas of race, of climate crisis, and many other areas. Analysis and activism has never done very much as a group, but when it does, it often brings in a rather radical kind of politics. My own activism, Palestine, South Africa in the past, economic injustice and Extinction Rebellion in the present day, is radical. I'm drawn to that. And that's why I think it's very important to retain a degree of skepticism, not to become too blind a believer in the line that such organizations as I just mentioned take. So mainstream, radical. The next one is professional politics. And Obviously, this is the one that gets therapists agitated, but it may not be as important as it sometimes feels when you're in it. Nevertheless, I don't think we can ignore, we in the Jungian world, for example, our dreadful professional politics, the way in which there is a willful ignoring of the economic, educational, and cultural barriers to diversity in our profession. It is quite wrong that we uncritically accept the notion of doctoral level clinical degrees as entry to the profession. Yes, I know that is difficult to achieve, whether we're talking about South Africa or Brazil or the United States. It's easier in Britain, actually. But I think this needs to be talked about, because if you erect the hurdle of a professional clinical qualification, you are automatically setting up a kind of filter, to put it mildly, as to who can apply. Also, in the area of professional politics, we have to consider whether or not the battle to end discrimination against gay men and lesbians in relation to training has been completely worked through. I think that some of the difficulties around transgendered people and phenomena is that they are receiving the legacy of the prejudice that was once more obviously attached to homosexuality. This is something I'm hoping we might talk about. In the Jungian world, I think we have done a pretty good job of addressing Jung's anti-Semitism. I think we've done a less good job in addressing racism, racial discrimination, and racial hierarchy in our field. And I think, and this gives me some pleasure, we are no longer taking refuge in the notion that Jung was just a man of his times. First of all, he had choices. Back then, he had choices. But secondly, Jung is dead. The question is, what are we going to do about it? It dismays me when I hear liberals in the USA in particular saying, well, Jungian analytical training is open to everybody. What's the problem? Because it isn't quite so simple. You all know that. So I've dealt with mainstream, radical, and professional politics. All of these have huge problems. There's politics in the session. Actually, what we do and the theories we bring to bear in the session is very interesting. How do we radicalize these? Decolonialize is the current jargon, but it doesn't really differ from radicalizing. My own attempt has been to conjure up the idea of the activist client, which doesn't just mean a client who is an activist, though it often does. The activist client is a client who has an active political position in the therapeutic relationship. And to give an example, it involves challenging the notion of the therapeutic alliance as a kind of marriage of equals. So there's a great deal of sessional politics, power, vulnerability, obviously. But there's still a problem in that most trainings, whilst they do cover what they call diversity or inclusivity, don't actually give many pointers or hints to the candidates or students about what do you do when political, social, and cultural material comes into your session. In this sense, I do feel a kind of failure, because I've been pushing and pushing and pushing and conducting surveys every few years about how to work with political, social, and cultural material. And I'm still getting the same responses year on, well, I don't do it every year, but every few years, I get the same responses. I want to, but I don't know how. Give me some reading. How do I do it? So I think there is a really interesting question for the future. So that's the end of the 4 different kinds of politics. Now we come to the manifesto. And some of you will have heard some of this in my, I don't know what the right word is, peroration at the end of the wonderful conference that we did with the San Francisco Jung Institute in October last year. So I did have 10 manifesto points. And I think I probably said them all on that occasion. I've just boiled them down to 3. And let me say right away, given that this is a somewhat confessional talk, I break these rules all the fucking time. Doesn't mean they're not the right rules, but they're very, very difficult to stick to. And I need to be self-forgiving as I just don't do what I say. 3. Firstly, if we are interested in psychotherapy and politics, we would be well advised not to try and do it on our own. In other words, groups of therapists interested in politics are not stupid, they're just pointless when it comes to politics. What we discovered in psychotherapists and counselors for social responsibility in the UK in the 90s was that there are groups out there who might welcome some kind of connection with psychotherapists. There are groups out there who think that psychotherapy is a luxury goods for very privileged and entitled and self-indulgent people, and they certainly wouldn't welcome alliances with psychotherapists. But we found that there are groups. You have to find the right groups. Doctors find it much easier because people respect doctors in ways that they simply don't respect therapists. Nevertheless, I want to say very clearly, and I'm going to use a slogan that probably some of you, especially people from the Essex world, will be absolutely sick of. Let's have a therapist on every committee or commission or policy initiative, but please, let's not have a committee of therapists. That is a total mess. The difficulty is that the therapists who are reaching other people have to eat a lot of humble pie, that psychology isn't the overarching or master discipline. I mean, it's okay. Academics say, well, there isn't a foundational overarching discipline, but they can dream on. In most life situations involving thinking people, there is a discipline that is more powerful than the others. Therapists depend on the psychological perspective, however understood, being the dominant discipline. That's why you often get on the analysis and activism list, Google group, which I know you're not all on, you often get people saying, well, what's the psychological attitude here? What's the psychological attitude here? As if it is felt that if we don't find out the right psychological attitude, then we can't do anything. So I think we need to dial it down, okay? Eat a little bit of shit, frankly. I mean, the record of psychotherapy, and I would put Jungian analysis at the heart of this comment, is not that great when it comes to contributing to politics. So that's the first one. Don't do it on our own. The second one is, and this is very difficult because it involves, for me, it involves cutting me off from things I really feel I have something to say about. It's really important, at least at this manifesto level, that people involved in analysis and activism, broadly understood, do not stay in safe areas for shrinks. Do not stay with parents, with family dynamics, with sexuality, and even for Jungians, with spirituality or soul work. That is a very seductive path to follow. But, and I'm not the only person who thinks this for sure, I'm sure Mary Watkins, for example, would agree with some of this. We need to be there when the deal is economic injustice, homelessness, when the deal is the climate crisis, but involving direct action, not just poems about how the world is this or this is that. And we need, increasingly, I feel, to be there when the topic is violence in society, especially male violence in society and in the wider world. And I say this with Afghanistan in mind, and I don't just mean Taliban Afghanistan. John Pilger wrote a really interesting historical survey of what it was like in Afghanistan when it was struggling to be a socialist type of country. It didn't work, of course, but it's something that has got completely forgotten. So what I'm saying is, don't stay in the safe areas. Now, this is difficult because I've written so much about the father. I've written a lot about sexuality in therapy. I'm not saying I should forget these things. What I'm saying is that's my soft option. That's my default position. That's what I've been trained to do. Now, one thing I do, and I have some friends here in London who have been with me on demonstrations. I go on a lot of demonstrations. It's not just because I'm manic. In fact, I find them very difficult. My hips hurt because you have to walk so slowly. And then the police make you stop, and that makes your hips hurt even more. But it is a way of getting out of what I know. And what I know is the father, the good enough father of whatever sex. What I know is psychological pluralism. I mean, this is, of course, a confessional talk, but I am so aware how I slide smoothly back into what I know. And I have many colleagues who slide smoothly back into what they know. I do have some colleagues who don't, and sometimes I don't. But the problem, as I say, is these are good rules, but very difficult ones to keep. Third, we must stop trying to prove our theories right. This is the biggest problem the project of linking therapy thinking with political issues has. The therapists want to be right, whether it's transcendent function right, soul right, depressive position right, mutual recognition right. I can go on. You see what I'm getting at? This is the narcissistic problem, and I am not outside it. I want to be right. But it's really difficult to be wrong when you're psychologizing about politics. Almost everything that's said is right. Kafka had a great quote about this, that a statement of a situation and its opposite are equally true. So it's no prizes for psychologizing all the time about political issues using, to me, theories that are sitting in a kind of filing cabinet or toolkit. We must stop trying to prove our theories right. That's the end of the manifesto. Not on our own, not in safe areas, and don't be right. Now we come to the politics of the person. And we started at 5 or 7 minutes past. I will bring this in at about 45 minutes for sure, if not earlier. The politics of the person. You know, I got invited once to an American growth center. I like growth centers. The Open Center in New York is absolutely amazing. And I wanted to talk about my stuff, and they wouldn't accept any of my titles. They were just too dry, too academic, too British, I don't know. In despair, as a joke, apologies to those friends who've heard this. As a joke, I said, getting in touch with your inner politician. Wow, they loved it. They really, really loved it. And that made me think that being personal about politics is something I should get more deeply involved in. So now I'm going to ask you to relax and listen to my barking voice, intended to be slightly hypnotic and reassuring, but essentially barking and hectoring. And I'm going to talk you through something. Please play my game. Please respond quietly now and out loud later. What is the style in which you typically engage with politics? Let me give you 4. I used to have 22. Now I only have 4. The first style is the heroic style. The hero sets out to basically kill the bull or defeat the opponent. Not all heroic political leaders are male, but it is essentially a male-oriented way of doing politics. Is that how you do it? Aggressively, charging, red mist. And there's an interesting subdivision of heroic personal politics, and that is martyrdom. Do you remember Jan Palach in 1969? Everyone says 68, but he actually poured gasoline on himself and set himself alight in January 1969 in Prague. And there have been other examples of people putting their bodies on the line. Martyrs are heroes. And that's why I have a lot of sympathy for the role of the martyr, which most Western political thinking has abandoned, although in the Middle Ages, it was not quite so absent. Hero. The second political style I call sibling, and it has everything to do with working collaboratively, working horizontally, working in, quite frankly, a feminist-inspired way. It sounds good. It often goes terribly wrong because people just talk and nothing is done, or the group splits. But sibling politics is a very valid style. Heroic, sibling, ostrich politics. I used to think the ostrich was an insult. But actually, I've become, and this is my Jungian bit, I suppose, I've become more and more interested in what people who don't do anything are doing. I'm not talking about bystanding. I'm talking about people who are deeply committed at some level of their psychological organization to something political, but they don't do anything. They put their heads under the sand. They don't read the papers. They don't watch the news. I've come to see that this is very often a rather valid way to do politics, and meditation is a good example of the ostrich style of doing politics. Now, some of you who've known me for years will be very surprised perhaps to hear me say this, but I think there is a value in passivity that is overlooked. Are you ostrich? Are you the kind of good ostrich I've been talking about, or just an ostrich? And sometimes you'll be all of these. styles I'm talking about. Then there's good enough politics. According to Winnicott, the baby processes the failure of the parents so that they become good enough in the baby's mind and in the baby's experience of life. At the heart of good enough politics as a style is an acceptance of failure. I could ask you to think about your political influences, your parents, your teachers. I could ask you to talk about your political and to think about your political energy level. But I'll leave it there with those political styles. It ain't what you do, it's the way that you do it. It ain't what you say, it's the way that you say it. And that's what gets results. We need to become more conscious of what kind of style we are in when we're doing politics. And we don't really think about this enough. I like the word style because along with Jim Hillman, I have come to see that depth is often hidden on the surface. And I think this is really important insight. So I am talking about style. I'm talking about what can be misunderstood as superficial. And by the way, a great deal of political dispute, especially in groups of apparently like-minded people, is because they're doing it stylistically differently. This is somewhat different from typology. But typology is my inspiration here, particularly the notion of the inferior function. Applied to political style, it means that the really interesting one is the one you're not very good at. Some people are really good at heroic, but not so good at sibling. That's me, actually. Others are frightened of being ostriches and meditating and taking the political issue deep inside themselves. Others really can't do sibling politics. I have real trouble with it, actually. I guess what I'm trying to do is to get you to locate which of those four you're not good at, you're crap at. That's your inferior function in terms of political style, and that is of interest to you. So I've now been going, believe it or not, only for 34 minutes. So I think I'm okay in taking another 10, maybe less. This is the third section of the talk. Do you remember the first section of the talk was, what do you mean by psychotherapy and politics? The second one was the politics of the person, that little talk about political style that I hoped you joined in on an imaginative level. The third one was two case histories, one that worked and one that didn't. In the early 2000s in Britain, the idea arose to put therapists in what we call job centers. That means that a person who went to look for a job but didn't find one would be told that they should go upstairs and see a therapist, usually a counselor, but trained people, to find out why they couldn't obtain employment. Ethical? Of course not. But once the Department of Work and Pensions puts its full authority behind something, it's very difficult to resist. And I'm sure all of you in your own countries will know what I'm talking about. We call this psychocompulsion, and the word kind of took off. So groups of people, some therapists, some disability campaigners, some people from left-wing or socialist organizations got together. We held demonstrations. We got journalists interested. We had letters published. We famously dressed up in orange Guantanamo type suits and tied ourselves together with chains. This was a group of therapists with an average age of about 60. Jesus, it was really freaky. It worked. It never, ever got out of the kind of trial phase of the project. It was successful because we had an alliance, especially with the disabled people, because those of you in Britain will know that disability campaigners are quite amazingly adept at dramatic interventions into politics. The famous one was the occupation of the House of Commons by wheelchairs a few years ago. Quite extraordinary. By the way, those of you who are Green Party supporters might be interested to know that the only member of parliament that came to talk to them in their occupation of the halls of Westminster was actually the only Green MP, Caroline Lucas. Good on her. So it really was, it fulfilled the manifesto, if you like. We weren't doing it alone. We were being humble. We were being allies. And because our target was unethical therapeutic practice, we had a lot to say. Well done us. The one that didn't go very well is the one that most of you here will know about more recently, and that is this whole question of Jung and Africans and the open letter published in the British Journal of Psychotherapy originally, that in a sense didn't call for anyone to do anything. It just put forward the idea that we had to become aware that there was a problem in the Jungian world in connection with race. Unfortunately, two things went wrong. First, we underestimated the adoration, idealization, and fetishization of Jung. And we were easily pushed back under the heading attacks on Jung. Jungians indulging in attacks on Jung. We were naive. Okay, I was naive because whatever complexes drive me so often to criticize Jung got a little bit out of control here. We should have put at the top in the biggest possible letters, this is not an attack on Jung. We did in the end, but it was too late. The other thing that went wrong is that we spread our campaign around. This letter got published in about 15 journals in 5 or maybe 6 languages. It made the Jungians, our community actually, look bad. Well, you could say, so what? It made the Jungians look bad. They deserve to look bad. But politics is about the art of the possible, of getting a result. And my idea to push this letter in all these languages, in all these serious psychoanalytic and psychological journals, it was too much. A few other things explain why this went wrong. One is everybody was terribly frightened. What would the IAAP think of them? Because it really wasn't a collection of way out mavericks that signed this letter. 31 people signed it, some are here. And we were all sober, serious, senior citizens. And we were frightened, and I was frightened, and I remain frightened. And I became completely unable to function when the IAAP announced it was going to make a big commitment to diversity. Well, we haven't seen much of what that commitment means as yet, but I'm sure, I have every confidence that we will. So I think that given that I was in a leadership role, I went a bit crazy. I forgot all the lessons of political organizing. I went much too far. I got involved in messianic fantasies and, in a sense, martyrdom. So, psychocompulsion worked, Jungian Africans didn't. And those are the two examples I want to give. I called them case histories. Now I would like to conclude. I don't know what I'm expecting people to say in response to this talk. The talk is a little narcissistic and self-centered, which is one reason I was happy to give it in Slovenia, where they don't know me, and not so happy to give it tonight, where you know me. Anyway, I don't know what to expect. I do know, and I'm feeling it in my body now, that I feel good to have given this talk. I'm going to end with a very little clinical anecdote and a slogan. I have a patient whose father is a very successful businessman, let's say, in Germany. And the father was always on the case of the son, my patient, that he was immature, he was childish, he didn't try hard enough, he didn't make the right decisions, he was interested in playing the guitar, blah, 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 blah. And I'm thinking, well, I've heard all this, mate. I mean, you know, we've been working together for 9 years and you're still talking about this. Then he remembered something, and this is what I want to share. This tyrannical tycoony father had a specially made fridge magnet. You know what I mean? A little thing with a magnet you put it on the fridge. And the slogan on the magnet was, if all else fails, lower your expectations. If all else fails, lower your expectations. And with that thought, I hand the meeting back to Stefano Carpani. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you very much. We're all muted, but this is a very strong and loving applause. Please start thinking of your questions, and I would like to shoot a question. Actually, Andrew, it is a provocative and political question. What for? Question mark. And what for is not coming from me. It's coming from one of your old buddies or comrades, Ali Campbell. You know, Ali Campbell suffers of depression, bipolarity. Today, one of his rants on Instagram, he said, what for? What for shall we rant and rebel and go on if we have this government? If, in your case, when you were working with Obama or his team, a newspaper is actually blackmailing you. I will read now. You reminded us in 2001, Andrew, 20 years ago, that the founders of psychoanalysis felt themselves to be social critics as much as personal therapists. You mentioned Freud, Jung, Maslow, Roger, Peirce, the Frankfurters, Reich, Fromm, and then you said recently, and recently was in the 90s, Orbach, Kulkarni, who is here with us today, Frosch. They began to consider society once more, but notes that although the project of linking therapy and the word is clearly not a new one, very little progress seems to have been done. Why? Because more therapists than ever want psychotherapy to realize the social and political potential that its founders perceived in it, but is aware of the large gap between wish and actuality. This list, Analysis and Activism, is about this, bridging wish and actuality. Tonight is bridging wish and actuality. Why? Because a month ago, when what happened in Afghanistan was on the media, on the list we started ranting about it. And different people suggested different options. One could be a dream matrix, and other would say, no, that's not enough. Andrew, what for?
Well, the question, what for, doesn't have an answer written in advance. What for can be followed by a very positive assessment of the value of this project. Or what for can be accompanied by an Italian shrug of the shoulders and, well, it depends. And the question of who decides which way it goes is that it's us. I mean, of course, I know Ali Campbell, and Ali Campbell has written a lot about depression and about masculinity. But if I may say, my children went to school with his children, I may say that he doesn't know much about sibling politics, about working with other people. He was a very dominant figure. At times, people felt he was the dominant figure in the Blair government. So I think he's a very interesting example of somebody who did not flesh out all the political styles that I've listed. But thank you for the question. It's typically provocative, but what for can go two ways or more than two ways when one is answering it.
Now we open the floor to our guests, and this is amazing because we were 98, so almost full house. We had a capacity of 100, we were 98, now we are 88, so I'm very, very happy. For us, for Analysis and Activism and all our guests. People, as Verena Kast would say, Leute, please share your questions. And I would like you to ask your question to Andrew, but we need to be a little bit German or Swiss, yeah, because otherwise Zoom will not help us. So raise your hand digitally, and I will ask you to, I will say your name and you will open your mic. Don't be shy. I'm already too shy, you know. Nobody? Come on.
I
Lynn,
don't
think Lynn should start. Lynn, would you like to ask a question or say something? Because you are a founding member of Analysis and Activism. And so to warm up a bit, I would like you to share your thoughts. Your mic, first, your mic. Yeah.
Stefano, I cannot say something in a small amount of time. I will say this, that the what for in relationship to the open letter at the Jung Institute was Jung Institute in San Francisco. The generation of sort of becoming aware, becoming ashamed, feeling guilty, being concerned. It opened up all the kind of energy that happens when things get very unsettled. So I feel that it did have a value, and it's having a value. And the other thing that I think politically is that for myself, I have to act locally, more or less. My mind is traumatized, and it doesn't function at all when I think of all the problems that are taking place in the world. And so I do think about them, but it immobilizes me. So then I kind of reconstrict myself to my locale, so to speak. Not with my ears closed, but so I guess I'm saying that this political energy, I see a great value in the collaborative. I think it's terribly hard work and it's very uncomfortable.
Yeah, but the point is that those who work collaboratively sometimes can't do the heroic bit. And we saw this with the open letter. Some people started to draw back. They sensed the criticisms in the wider community. You know about this, Lynn.
Yes.
And my model of these 4 styles is specially designed to look at what doesn't happen as well as what does. And I think it is very difficult for therapists who are naturally drawn to sibling politics to go into a more heroic mode. But I think your question is right and very important to raise it. But listen, I'm a bit worried. I don't see myself here how people put their hands up.
Wait, don't worry. I manage these. In fact, we have Dr. Kevin Liu, very young scholar, rising star in analytical psychology from Essex University. Kevin, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Steph. No, that's very kind. Not so young anymore. Hey, Andrew, how's it going?
Yeah.
Thank you for the talk. Just jumping, on from what Lynn said, I was actually quite struck that you framed the open letter as a failure. And this is more of a comment than a question. And I can see in one sense, you telling us a bit more of the narrative of what was happening, in certain organizations and how they reacted, how you may perceive it as a failure. But I guess it depends on who's listening. So I gave this example previously, but I'll provide it again now, that I was at a psychotherapeutic conference last year before lockdown actually occurred. And someone, a trainee from this organization, stood up, and the topic is on race and racism. And this person said, at least the Jungians have published an open letter. So at least they've done it. And actually, I'm envious and I want to be a Jungian. So I think my kind of response to that is who's doing the listening and who's actually doing the hearing. So yes, for those who might be more elder in the community, have more experience, there might be certainly those concerns. But who might you be inspiring? Or who's the letter inspiring in terms of the future generation? Who's actually listening? So there might be concern at this level, but there might be planting a seed for the future. Anyways, just a thought.
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting thought. I don't resonate that way. You see, if you think about the manifesto, my 3 points, the group of Jungians who signed this letter, and it wasn't a petition, it was just a letter of, I think, 31 people. Most were analysts, not all. We did it on our own. We made no alliances at all with organizations of Africanist therapists. We had, of course, I think 3 of the 4 American analysts who have Africanist roots. But the point is, we didn't actually make alliances with institutions involved in racial justice. We never came into contact with Black Lives Matter or its predecessors, nothing. It was just something that we felt was so important that we just went ahead and did it. That is a mistake, in my view. Secondly, we stayed within Jung as a kind of safe zone for us. We didn't really talk in the letter or in the discussions that we had about the experience of people of color. We didn't talk about that. We stayed in our comfort zone, which is against my manifesto. I mean, I'm responsible for these things, okay, to some extent. But I'm trying to use this as an example to sort of get people's critical thinking. And then we must stop trying to prove our theories right. I don't think we did stop trying to prove our theories right. I think we were in revisionist mode. We were not in radical mode. We were not in transformative mode as regards thinking. We talked about usual things, having different syllabuses and all the rest of it. But I think it was a very kind of self-satisfying kind of approach to thinking. So was it a failure? I'm going to say yes, because I'm giving myself only yes or no, which goes against a lot of what I've said about success and failure not being so clear cut. Nevertheless, I'm trying not to discuss this letter, but to use the letter as an example of the kinds of pickles and mistakes therapists who want to do politics can get into. And that's what I think, if my talk tonight has any utility at all, it is as a guide to how we do this, because we don't really think about how we do this.
There is a written comment by Jessica Steele. Jessica, would you like to share your comment on the open mic, please?
Hi there, can everybody hear me okay? My mic is sometimes a bit funny. Yes, I apologise, I came into this late because I thought it was on a different day. So I haven't actually heard Andrew's talk, even though I was really looking forward to it. But I'm from Kevin's cohort, the latest MA in Jungian and post-Jungian studies. Jung's work is central to my practice, but as part of my practice and as part of my dissertation, I'm currently working with a group of activists and scholars in America in cultural studies. And I think some of the questions that Andrew and others are raising are really important, because particularly as a younger person who kind of spends a lot of time online, a lot of my views of politics and civics is through what's called participatory culture and participatory politics. So the way in which my generation and younger engage in political and civic thinking is actually often quite different, possibly, from the way some older people might engage with it. And I think that's actually really important to take on board, because it's something that I don't often see in the political, in Jungian studies, but also just in general, being recognised. But in terms of what Andrew was saying about the letter, you know, I'm actually just reaching out to these scholars, and it's difficult because of some of the epistemological differences between our fields. But there's an interest there, and there's a curiosity, and you know, that letter is nothing's ever going to be perfect. You know, we can't go into this with the absolute perfect response. But that letter and, you know, some of the conversations being had is just really important to say, listen, you know, I know in the past that Jung's views are really egregious and damaging, and I know I'm a white person, so I can't, you know, fully speak to how damaging they can be, but I've recently looked into them and I found them appalling, which is something I wasn't aware of a lot of his racial views until recently. But being able to point to that letter and knowing that there is a part of our field that's willing to do the work is really, really important. And it's really important to be able to show to them that there is a break between the older Jungian thinking and the newer one. So that's just a point I wanted to raise.
Are you sure you didn't listen to the talk? Look, I have two things to say. I'm not going to go on anymore about whether it was a success or whether it was a failure. I'm just trying to get people to think. And you are doing the thinking. There are two elements in what you've just been saying, Jessica, that really thrill me. One is you bring in the generations. This is important, partly because for the Jungian world, there is a kind of exclusion on young people. It isn't, of course, written down, but it still involves the notion that there's a first half of life psychology and a second half of life psychology. And in the first half of life, you get laid, you get a job, you get a degree. And in the second half of life, you go into Jungian analysis. This is absurd. I mean, there are so many absolutely cretinous, deeply unconscious senior people in the field, present company, meaning me included, that the idea that the second half of life is a special vertex is just not to be tolerated anymore. The other thing that you're bringing in, and this is what's music to my ears, is that you're using social media, although that's not the main point I want to make. You're using social media to contact people who do not necessarily have the same knowledge base as you, but have the same overall thrust and orientation. It used to be called rainbow politics. No one uses that phrase anymore, but it's very important. And I want to come back to one thing I did say about the open letter. It is, to me, looking back, deeply shocking, even amazing, that we never made any contact with therapists or anyone else of color. We just didn't.
Andrew, I want to move on from the open letter, because these group analysis and activism always go back to the open letter, but also raise up a little bit of friction and acrimony. For sure, we Jungians are heterogeneous, you know, and sometimes we're not very cooperative. Nowadays, there are talks about fluidity, not only liquidity, LGBTQI+, but someone in the audience 25 years ago, following what you just said, Andrew, wrote a book titled Lesbians and Lesbianism, a Post-Jungian Perspective. Of course, I'm talking about Claudette Kulkarni. This book is interesting because Claudette explores, and I'm reading from the cover, explore lesbian experience from a Jungian and feminist perspective. Through interviews with women and who see themselves as lesbians or who are in a lesbian relationship. She concludes that when a woman, and what now we can say any person, finds herself, himself, itself, themselves, another woman, she is often responding to a profound psychological instinct to act. She's often responding to a profound psychological instinct to act, in spite of internal conflict or external opposition, and that this is a significant move in the service of personal and collective individuation and a movement toward achieving self-understanding. This is the bridge between wish and action, what you wrote about 21 years ago. We have a comment by Ursula. Ursula, would you like to share your comments on the open mic? Ursula?
Well, I think
Yes.
Andrew said it well enough. Some of the reasons that he felt the action of the letter failed is, in my opinion, quite similar to why quite a number of the actions that the feminists did fail, because we had no allies, or not sufficient allies. We thought we could all do it all by ourselves. And I think I don't want to repeat what Andrew said, because you said it much, much better. But I hope and I trust that you understand what I mean. Nothing more than that.
Totally. And this whole question of allies is something that feminism is constantly engaged with, it specifically the role of men.
Yes.
It's one of the most interesting paradoxes in politics. If you try to get to the middle ground all the time, you won't get anywhere. But if you stay on the extremes, you still won't get anywhere. It's so difficult, and therapists need to talk more about how to juggle between our marginal status as not fully accepted in Western societies, not really, and how we might move to the center. It's something it's a conversation that isn't happening. That's the point. And that's what I wanted to talk about, exactly this whole question of allyship. And I may be wrong in saying this, but I don't know how many people here have studied the literature, the considerable literature on the role of the ally. It's probably, maybe you have, Ursula, but I think a lot of people probably have not. And it's really important to talk about it. On our analysis and activism list, which many people here belong to, we have not had in 7 years a single discussion on this. And in 4 conferences, we've never had a single paper on this.
Well, maybe this is a very good suggestion for all of us. As you pointed out, there are nearly, I don't know, 90 people. So hopefully for the next conference, we will think about more how important allies are. And I think particularly for so-called women's issues, we do need allies in a world which is still very much structured by patriarchal values.
I agree.
Dennis?
Yeah, I came into Jungian psychology with a strong environmental background, and it's been one of my main interests in my writings. And I think of politics in more the meta Jungian level, and I think of all the young men that I work with, and I've had several come into my practice because of Jordan Peterson. And to me, the political level that I talk to them about is at this kind of meta level that the corporations are what Jung would call the monster, the international monster. The environment is resource-based and a waste dump. This is the way I talk with my analysans, that there's no, the spiritual forms that have carried us are dead. Christianity is a dead myth. So how do you find your spiritual life, and then how do you connect that to the land? And this, so that I work with my clients with dreams about that. So, I mean, all these things that we're talking about are really important, but I've really been very disappointed in the Jungian community that it's all going to be swamped by environmental issues if we don't address these at these meta levels that I think Jung was so wonderful at. There was one more thing, yeah, especially in America. So then I talk about money and the power in politics, and then power and eros and so on. So those are the meta levels, and then to encourage the analysans to become involved in whatever political interest or environmental interest appeals to them. But I think we have to offer them a meta framework for understanding why our culture is so messed up, particularly here in America. I can't speak for Europe, but it's a nightmare over here with Trumpism and the Republican Party and so on. So I just wanted to kind of insert that into the discussion here.
The bit I want to pick up on, Dennis, and thank you for that, and you know I know your work. The bit I want to pick up on is what we do with this stuff in our clinical work. You may remember I gave a model of 4 different kinds of politics, and one was sessional politics. It's really very important. It may be, frankly, the one place where one can safely say the therapy world has a contribution to make by doing therapy in a political direction. Now, that is not a very big claim. In other words, we shouldn't be too excited about it. But you see, with regard to all the other kinds of politics, mainstream politics, radical politics, to pick the 2 most important ones, there really is a question of whether we matter at all. Now, I don't think Alistair Campbell was talking about therapists when he said what for, but it is a very intuitive idea that Stefano introduced. I mean, look, I do this stuff. I'm enthusiastic for this. I've also said I'm skeptical and I'd sail very close to failure, but do we matter at all? Now, I think Jessica may have gone, I don't know, but this is a generational thing. Of course, the older people should say, do we matter? And the younger people say, well, you don't necessarily matter on your own, but you matter in relation to us younger people, or something like that. And this, I think, is really the critical thing. Is the therapy thinking in relation to politics a project that actually has substantial action-oriented value or not? I mean, I know what I wish. Of course, I wish that it should, and particularly in relation to the climate crisis, Dennis. But I'm not sure that in relation to the climate crisis, even the very important body of Jungian ideas about climate, whether that is actually really making the contribution it could or it should. So I'm being quite provocative here and quite, how can I put it? This evening, I'm in love with failure. I'm in love with, do we matter? Do I matter? Did I matter? And this is very important. So it's a generational talk. It was obviously billed as a generational talk. I began by saying, I'm a baby boomer. And we baby boomers think we're the bee's knees. We are just so terrific, are we? I can see so many people in their 40s here, not so many, a few. Monica, what are you thinking?
Monica, it's your turn now.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Andrew, for this brilliant talk. The topic of failure is so interesting. And as you know, I love your intuition, initial intuition that politics and psychotherapy share some ground, even if now you are talking of failure. And I was thinking about don't be in safe space, in safe spaces, in safe areas. And I was struck by the initial comment by Lynn when she said, you know, when I'm feeling traumatized, I cannot think, I cannot say nothing. And so I was rephrasing in my mind your point of the manifesto, do not stay in safe places, like do not think safe. I mean, you can be in safe places, but you don't have to think safe, which is something that is very similar to the other point, that we must stop trying to prove our theories right. And what I'm trying to say is that maybe what you are thinking now as failure is that kind of cognitive closure that comes from feeling oneself attacked by someone else. And this is the same for us and for other people, of course. So going back to the open letter, I think that, okay, that wasn't a failure, in my opinion. But what makes us feel it as a failure is that is the attack, meaning is the fact that it is how the point is made. So I think that there is something about process that needs some attention about politics and psychotherapy. I think this is a very, very important topic that deals both with with politics and psychotherapy processes. How change is possible, how to manage the change. And
yes.
Yeah, this is just my comment.
You know me well. Was it a failure because Andrew got attacked? This is a really interesting question. I'm sorry to say that I have thought about this. It's not like you've given me an aha moment, but you've said it out in public. And I think this is something I want to say something about. In my analysis, in my training analysis, I was complaining about how my parents were rather critical of me, rather cruel, even sometimes mocking. And my analyst said, well, you see what they're doing to you, but do you see what you're doing to them? In other words, I was in the grip of a kind of adolescent fantasy or daydream in which I could attack. Let's move it into the open letter area. I could attack the Jungian world. I could attack the IAAP. I could attack the president of the IAAP. I could attack Jung, if that's what people wanted to say. Why would I be surprised if they attack back? And this is the adolescent that I think tried to understand more and integrate more. The complaining at being attacked for attacking. So I think where you have said something very important personally, but I'm hoping this is not just relevant to me. I really hope that there is something about being attacked and not wanting to own what you did to get the attack. This is quite important. I mean, I have actually talked about this with friends in Extinction Rebellion, because they also have to engage with the fact that they are vilified, humiliated, and mocked in the right-wing and central British press, and they are very, very unhappy about it. But of course they are. How can you do the things that they do and not be attacked? So there's something about the inner life of the political activist where they, meaning he or she, but they have to realize that the struggle is something that they are promoting, and maybe they have to promote it. Anyway, that's my response to your remark. Yes.
Thank you very much.
Susan?
The feminine is rising.
Andrew, do you want to answer or add?
Sure.
Or someone else?
No, I will. It's a very Susan Rowland contribution, and it's producing quite an Andrew response, which is not to contradict, not to say, no, it's not, because it is. But what it made, the way you said it and everything, made me, the words that came into my mind is, how are you so sure?
Because the feminine isn't what it used to be. Patriarchy is breaking down, and the feminine is in all sorts of resistances, including the existence of depth psychology itself. Where I'm coming from here is a sense that at some sort of level, there's a kind of stuckness in talking about politics. It's the word politics. It's kind of, it's small, it's too small when we face what we are facing. And the feminine is rising is not necessarily a good thing, because this includes hurricanes. It includes the feminine nature revolting against what we've done to it and causing climate change. But it's also in most of the so-called political areas that people here care about. And it's bigger. It's bigger than the language that we're using.
You may well be right, but let me push back. I don't want to defend the use of the word politics. Let's not do that. But isn't it possible that your introduction of the feminine is itself a retreat to a post-Jungian safe space? And I want to give an example which is going to annoy a lot of people about our analysis and activism list, using something that Stefano said, that when we were in the middle of intense discussions about Afghanistan, somebody proposed a social dreaming matrix. Now, social dreaming matrices are really important. I went to Gordon Lawrence's, I believe in it, blah, blah, blah. But it was a flight to what was safe for us. And as you know, I've written Beyond the Feminine Principle, and I think there is a real problem with the feminine. So I'm pushing it back to you. You're in a safe space. You're using a substantial, what's the word? A substantive, is that right? The feminine, like the whatever. So I think, forgive me, you are as guilty of this problem as me. Which is fine, actually.
Well, I don't accept that, but that's okay. Stefano called on me to speak because I said that I would only annoy you if I did. And Stefano has the instinct of a good MC. One thing occurs to me is that, you know, you Jungians, and I can say the term you Jungians when I'm saying you therapists, and this discussion has been about the therapeutic point of view, and that's absolutely fine. Why wouldn't it? I'm the outsider here. But there are other professional roles, and many people in this group here right now have more professional roles than just the therapist's professional role. So my professional role is a teacher. And one of the things I do is say things that I hope will touch my class in ways in which they are open to come back at me, as you just have. Now, in some senses, I don't know if the feminine exists, You know, I'm not even saying it does exist, but I am saying that it's rising, because that I feel, that is my intuition. And that is what I'm offering. But,
Yes.
you know, we can move on.
No, I'm a bit surprised that you thought I would be annoyed. I mean, we've talked so many times. I mean, that's a bit of a shock, but okay, I have to live with that. I have to live with this piece of public shaming. I can't imagine why you did it, but I don't know. Never mind.
I'm not shaming you, Andrew.
Well,
I'm not shaming you. I
turned-
took a big risk. I took a big risk, and you know, you've just made it bigger. But I can live with that. It's fine. I know you've written against the feminine principle, and I actually agree with you. What I'd like to just establish between us right now is that I can say the feminine is rising and mean it without accepting the metaphysical structure that you argued against. When you argued against it, and I wrote about it favorably in Younger Feminist Revision, I still said at the time that goddess feminism was valuable, important, and it did good things. And I still believe that. So that's why I said what I said, not as an attack on you, but because I was asked what was I thinking, and this came to me. And as a teacher, this is what I do. If I feel something intuitively, I put it out into the class.
Let me pick up on what I think is also very important in what you said about that this is a talk that revolves around therapy, therapists, and their roles. This is true. However, and you may remember I talked about this in the Pittsburgh conference of the IAJS, many people are all-rounders. They are both therapists and academics, or they're therapists and researchers, or what have you. So I think that you're right, that the image of the therapist has a problem in that it is limiting. It really is limiting. However, many therapists are not limited in their views of the world. You work in an institution which has lots of therapists for whom that particular description would fit. And by the way, it's absolutely vital, and I said this in Pittsburgh, that there are people in our field who are not therapists, and there are people in our field who have not much time for therapy and therapists. This is absolutely vital, because if the academy is going to continue in its role as the cultural critic of the clinician, there have to be people in the academy who have nothing to do with clinical work, like yourself. It's really important.
Susan, thank you. I'm very happy you stepped in. And these also prove how Jungians, or how we therapists, are fiery and ready to fire up. But this is because, you know, people paid so much to join, so we are giving them a little bit of entertainment as well. Well, we are beyond the end of this first analysis and activism talk. If you have something to say, people, say it now, raise your hand. Before you do so, I want to connect again to my first question, what for? Because you, Andrew, Politics on the Couch 2001, you said you would expect to find therapists having views to offer on social issues that involve personal relations. You wrote these few years after, if I might share, when you were in the cockpit of the Labour Party with Tony Blair, Tony Giddens, Ali Campbell. But, and you know what I think, and you know that I come from Cambridge sociology, where Giddens was a teacher. The social, let's follow what Susan said. The feminism is rising, we need more feminine. How about sociology is the masculine? Sorry, I'm very banal. And the feminine is the psyche, the soul. We need more psyche. We need more soul. We need more therapist in the cockpits, in the decision room, to look at things differently. Labour Party was a disgrace because they looked too much at sociology and little at psychology. And this could be said for many, many male-oriented governments.
Well, this is your work, the construction and use of the Jungian Frankfurt School, where social theory and depth psychology, clinical depth psychology, can come together. If you want to say it's a masculine, feminine interaction, that's fine with me. The biggest problem in all of this is that very few sociologists are that interested so far in our ideas, in Jungian and post-Jungian ideas. So this idea, this notion, this ambition to link sociology and depth psychology is great, but somehow there's a fundamental inequality that hasn't really been
well, especially from the fact that sociologists know the theory. Giddens, Bauman studied Freud and beyond, the Frankfurt School, but they are not trained psychoanalysts, which is a big difference. We have Frosso, if you want to open your mic.
Yes, I'm a total stranger here. I'm Greek and I'm group analyst, but Andrew Samuel's ideas are not strange to me at all. I'm particularly interested in this topic, and what I want to say is that I have been an activist for many years, and I have been using my group analytic ideas in collectives and assemblies where people have a lot of difficulty to talk and not to fight. And I'm very happy as years go by, I'm more skillful in doing that. So this is a use of my therapy skills to do. What is my style? My style is collaborative, of course, because I think it's the most valuable one today, that we need to have communities, talking communities, as you say. And it was heroic in my youth when we had the junta, and I was against it, and I was drawn into the police station and all that. But what I want to say is that now that somebody talk about it, that the climate crisis is in front of us and has put the whole humanity in danger, I think that we have to think how far our political horizon is. Do we think that this kind of political organization of our societies can help us to solve the climate crisis? Representative democracy. I'll say just a few words for that. I think representative is an illusion, complete illusion, and I think that we must say that to people. It's an illusion. They're not representatives. We cannot call them back if they don't do what we want them to do. And also democracy is an illusion. It's an oligarchy. It's actually an alliance. They have an alliance with a financial oligarchy. A big part of science is with them for reasons that are against the climate, against the social justice, and against everything. So whatever, we may not do something about it, but we think about it, to allow ourselves to think about how far the horizon, the political horizon of ours is. This is what I want to say.
I think you're talking about some kind of colonization of the mind. And I agree with a lot of what you say about the illusion of representative democracy. in particular, its failure in country after country to tackle questions of inequality of wealth, some of which are, of course, underpinned by gender politics. Not all, but some. My own interest is very much in how citizens invest, and I use the word deliberately, but I mean invest psychologically, in unfair economic systems. They are somehow attracted to the sadism, the hierarchy, the jouissance of economic inequality. And this, you are really right. This is not going to be addressed by elections. This is a question of zeitgeist, a question of deep cultural change, what Dennis Merritt said, talking about the meta level. Now, here I want, because I think we should stop soon, I want to swing it round to my main point. What is the role of the individual psychotherapist, and that includes group analysts, and groups or organizations of therapists and analysts? What is the role in addressing such fundamental meta issues like economic inequality? Let me give you one British example, that there has been a much proclaimed change in the organization of social care and health in Britain. But one thing that was never touched was inheritance. And I gave a talk on this for the Psychosocial Wednesday group of the Analysis and Activism. Inheritance, which we are asked to believe is natural, inheritance stops dead movement towards economic inequality. And so it's fascinating to me how, at the same time as our government proclaims a revolution in social care, it leaves intact the main motor of economic inequality, which is inheritance. That's my response to you, but I don't think it was doing 100% justice to your very deep comment. But shouldn't we stop?
No, because I think if we keep on, Andrew, we reach midnight. So we should do this also on Sylvester night, New Year's evening. So you will not have the problem to talk about your parents. We don't have the problem to have dinner with our parents, and it will be much more fun. Sorry, joke. Last question. You didn't get it, Andrew, right? Don't worry. Leslie, last question from you, and then we say good night. Leslie?
Leslie? Is this Leslie Gardner?
It's our Leslie, the feminist Gardner. Gardner, are you there? Perhaps your mic is muted.
I've already left.
No, I'm here. I'm just I raised my hand kind of by accident, but but it was kind of in response to Susan's comment. Where I disagree with Susan often is characterizing the feminine as if it were kind of an essentialist aspect, register. But I agree with her, on the other hand, that there is a feminisms, I call it, but approach that subverts hierarchy, subverts the kind of power discussions that we sometimes have, and the authority of a therapist. I think Susan mentioned briefly, I'm not quite prepared for this, as I say, but Susan's right to point out that depth psychology itself is under attack from feminist approaches because of the confusions of identity and where personality is, how it's defined, how we talk about it. And I think one thing we just had a conference about classicists and depth psychology, and one thing that came up was just that the training and orientation of depth psychologists can lead to solutions that are not necessarily valid. But that's all. I'm not entirely prepared right now. But I just wanted to support what Susan had to say from kind of a different approach. So that's it.
No, I think the critique of therapy should have been apparent and implicit in what I said, but it wasn't. So I'm now thinking, why? What did I not say? What did I not think to say that would have embraced, anticipated, chimed with some of the things that are being said? And I can't answer this, but you do remember when Stefano talked about me telling him all the time that I identify primarily as a plain, ordinary therapist, it might indicate that I have some problem with throwing out the whole project. And I do. However, I believe it is in urgent need of at least reform, if not some kind of radical series of changes. And I do think that the main motor of new thinking about therapy does come from feminist sources. I don't think we would have such an understanding of the power dynamics and differentials in the psychotherapy relationship without feminist thinking, for example. So I just wanted to leave it there. But I am struck that I somehow managed not to indicate my discomfort with the whole business of therapy, as well as with the specific project of political, psychological interface. It's interesting. You know, I'm interested in what I didn't say.
We can organize another Analysis and Activism talk about this. Now, the last question from Tine, and then we will say good night or have a nice dinner to everyone for those on the other side of the world. Tine.
Thank you. I will be quick. I was touched, Andrew, when you talked about all the mistakes connected to the letter and personal background. But what I was thinking is much bigger mistake others, including me, are doing is actually to do nothing, you know, which is very much staying in the theory, talking, and there it stops. And I think, of course, if one wants to walk, one has to stumble, sometimes do some mistakes, but somehow the worlds of psychotherapists, including me, we are still not walking mainly, except you and some exceptions.
I don't know whether these people will ever arrive.
Somebody is unmuted and talking. Can you please mute yourself, please? I don't know who is there. I think I don't know. Tine, did you conclude or would you like to conclude?
Yes. It was just this thought. It's much, you know, this was wrong, but then I think it's much more wrong to do nothing.
Yes. Well, to be honest, that is my personal view. I am extroverted. Yes, I'm extroverted. Thank you very much. I'm maybe a hysteric in a certain kind of way. I enjoy playing with roles of hero and martyr and things like this. So I naturally agree with you because of my personality, as well as on ethical grounds.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, everyone. There are many messages in the chat. Now the chat will disappear because we will disconnect, but we can continue this conversation on analysis and activism. If you're not on our listserv, please email me and we will add you. We need to continue this conversation. Hopefully we'll have more analysis and activism talks. It was simply amazing, 98 people from everywhere. Well, everywhere means the West for now. So hopefully we'll have more people from Asia and Africa and other countries. We also...
May I just tell you what I'm doing? I'm trying to make a copy of the chat.
Yeah, maybe we can do it with Tine. Yeah, we can do that.
Okay.
So that's it, Andrew. Thank you.
Well, just...
I saved the chat.
If everyone wants to unmute and just clap hands is okay, is the end. Be a little bit foolish.
Thank you. Many thanks.
Thanks very much.
Many,
Good
many
night.
thanks.
Take care.